And I was going to go first, but it was great having Gary here. So I'm going to give general information about parking and some specific. Basically the outline I'm going to talk about is go over how parking and how it's regulated. I'm going to talk about managing demand and the relationship between the size of the garage and mode split. I'm going to talk about approaches that we've recently used. We're going to talk about the master transportation plan and also demographic trends and pressures that are occurring. A couple of four themes that will, four themes that will keep coming up. That each building needs to work regarding the amount of parking it has and its employee transportation. That the building needs to be seen in context with the neighborhood and the county as a whole. The methodology that we talk about has to be based on county policies, has to be based on data and fairness, and a need for flexibility because times are changing, as we talked about, whether it has to do with how many employees are squeezed in, the change in technology for how garages are operated. We have to create a system that is flexible. So first, just a little bit about, as everybody knows, parking in general is divided into two different types. We've got on-street parking and we've got off-street parking. And together they make one parking system. And in many people prefer one over the other. For short trips they tend to prefer on-street parking, and for longer stays, like for employees, or commuters, we certainly prefer that they use off-street parking. The on-street parking supply is generally fixed. The county is building some new roads, new cut-throughs, so we can add a little bit of new parking spaces every once in a while, but generally we can't add a lot more parking supply onto the on-street parking. Generally, parking in the commercial areas, we've got approximately about 6,000 metered spaces, maybe closer to 5,500 metered spaces in the commercial areas. A lot of competition in the commercial areas for parking. Clearly, we all can imagine you've got buses, you've got taxis, you've got loading zones, you've got short-term vehicles, you've got long-term vehicles. So there's a lot of competition in the commercial areas for parking on the streets. Different techniques for managing the parking there. We use time limits, we use meters. Let me just catch my notes here. And then in the residential areas, we certainly have different expectations depending on the density. Generally, we try to tell people in the single-family houses that in general, you can expect to park on your block. Don't expect to park in front of your house, but you might be able to expect to park in your block. If you live in a multifamily building, maybe you should expect to park, within a couple of blocks of your building, but we really hope to park in the building. So that's on-street parking, which really isn't the focus, but I just wanted to mention it. Off-street parking, there are basically two different types of off-street parking. We've got commercial parking garages in dense downtowns. We don't have very much of that in Arlington. I've got a picture here of the Boston garage, which is one could sort of say it's a standalone garage, though it is, as we all know, right next to the Boston Mall and office building there. But certainly in DC and some other places, there are standalone commercial parking garages. But generally in Arlington, parking is accessory to the primary land use, and it's regulated by the zoning code. So when you build an office building, the parking comes with it, and the zoning ordinance says for a office building, if you're by right, this is how much parking you have to build. If your site plan, as we all know, it's negotiated to some extent. So generally, municipal parking regulations, Arlington's basically parking regulations are based on minimum parking requirements, and most other municipalities that's the same way. Certainly there are many that also are now getting into maximums and using alternative means for regulating parking. Minimum parking requirements were really started in the middle of the last century as more and more cars were driving on the roads. Jurisdictions were deciding, it's in the public interest to require how much parking should meet the demand of cars going to buildings. The traditional methods of, this is my old presentation, but that's okay. The traditional methods for deciding how much parking should be required of a building are using national surveys. For instance, ITE, which I see Peter is holding up. Peter, hold up the ITE parking generation manual. We put on our website the 4 pages that come out of that, or 6 pages that come out of that for office. For instance, what ITE does is they do samples of different jurisdictions, and they graph them to show in these different jurisdictions what was the parking demand at this different type of use. So there's 6 pages on office, there's 4 pages on bowling alleys, there's 3 pages on something else.
Assuming that the price is 0.
Assuming that the price is 0.
Which makes it irrelevant.
Right. Which makes it irrelevant.
No, it's not irrelevant.
Well, we'll get into that.
That's a core topic for our discussion.
That will be a core topic. And most of the numbers are also from suburban locations. Recently, in this last 4th edition, they have added some urban examples so that you can see a different graph for urban office than you can for suburban. But still, it is based on free parking. And in fact, Arlington really doesn't use the ITE, but it is a standard that is used many places in the country, and it is often referred to. What is more common for Arlington is we'll go look and see what other people are doing. We will look and see what Portland's doing in Seattle, and we'll look at the district in Montgomery County and Alexandria, and then we see, does this work? Alternatively, perhaps, and this is what we're all now talking about, is should we be looking at site-specific analysis for when a developer comes up and says, how much parking should we build, and the county will judge that proposal. And in doing something like that, we will look at the development type and size, development density and design, demographics, availability of transportation choices and how they're managed, surrounding land use mix, and what kind of off-site parking there is. Other ways to regulate parking supply besides minimum parking. In Arlington, we do talk about shared parking, and we'll get into the master transportation plan a little later. But, and Peter started to mention in the previous conversation some examples where we do have shared parking. You take the example of the Cheesecake Factory building. Many of you probably know doesn't have any parking in that particular site, but they use the parking in the Orvis building right across the street, so they got credit. And I think Peter mentioned they happen to also be the same landowners.
Same
quite,
site plan.
They're no longer the same landowner.
But they're no longer the
They
same.
were at the time.
That's right.
At the time of the site plan, they were the same, controlled by the same developer.
Right.
But they were always intended to be sold separately.
And now they do have different owners.
Yes.
Right. And same with, for instance, when I believe when Strayer, the Strayer property was built, there's no parking specifically for the Strayer building across the street, with the understanding that people who go to school there can use the parking lot right here and use parking in this building. So Arlington is doing some shared parking, and certainly it is encouraged in the MTP parking element. In lieu fees, we've talked about that a little bit, and this broke, I think it was at the first meeting where Chris and Peter were asking about Columbia Pike, and in fact, the Columbia Pike form-based code, and I did put that on the website, does say that a developer can choose to pay the county money instead of building parking, and the county will buy spaces and add them to another private private developer's parking garage. And in fact, in Columbia Pike, there are 2 examples where the county has done that. It wasn't specifically from fees from developers that hadn't built as much parking, but the mechanism is set up so that the county, in fact, in Columbia Pike in 2 places, has built extra parking in private garages, both at the Halsted and in Penrose. So the in lieu parking, we do have it, the possibility for it in Columbia Pike, and so that's separate from minimums. Other communities, they have, like context-specific standards, so they might say, well, in this district, let's have this amount of parking. Let's say, for instance, in DC, if you're within a certain radius of the metro station, you will have a certain parking requirement. And so it's different for each context, so that happens places. Maximum limits are in some jurisdictions, so similar to minimums where you'll have a requirement and minimum, you'll say you have to have X amount of spaces per square feet. The same thing with maximums, you'll say you cannot go above X number of spaces per square feet. Centralized parking facilities and management, similar to the Montgomery County situation where developers can pay instead of paying for parking, and the government will pay for centralized parking instead of the developer having to do it. Just some other ways of
Does
dealing with.
Arlington has no examples of that?
Would,
Or does Baltimore count? Boston Garage. When the tower went up, did the developer pay into the garage,
I
for
don't,
example?
I don't think so.
No.
I think there was so much excess parking over and above what the mall required that they just effectively were full. I mean, the county built the extra level in order to facilitate the ice rink.
Yeah, after the fact.
In centralized parking facilities, we refer to those that either the government runs or private.
often the
Usually
government will,
government.
in the case of Montgomery County, for instance, the government is running the garage.
Right, okay.
Do you know, sir, if they have a parking authority that does that, or is it just government?
In their case, it's government, because I know the guy who
Because an authority
runs
might
it.
have bonding capacity as well.
Exactly.
to build.
Certainly other places have authorities. Managing the demand and understanding the relationship between mode split and garage size. This is just sort of a simplistic chart that shows factors that affect parking demand. Just sort of shows different factors that each one of these, this arrow is a continuum of similar factors. The factors on the top encourage more parking, and the factors and the continuum on the green encourages less parking. So for instance, the first arrow on the top, it says free parking. If it's free, more people will park in the facility. If the motorist pays the full cost of parking, that's on the bottom in the green, it's more likely that you'll have less people parking. The next arrow shows if there's no TDM provided, and I think probably everybody in the room knows that's transportation demand management and the encouragement of using alternatives, there will be more people will park, but if there's on the other end of the continuum, if you've got a site-specific TDM program provided, less people will park. Next one, auto-centric development, means you need, and there'll be more parking, variety of travel options available. The bottom one, you'll need less parking. The next one, when you have large blocks of a single land use, you'll often need more parking, but if you've got a mixed-use neighborhoods, the other end of the continuum, there'll be more sharing. I was talking about the example of the hotel and office, things like that. On the furthest one to the right, if you need to drive for midday trips, people will bring their cars, but if you've got a walkable neighborhood, people don't need to bring their cars, you won't need as much parking. It's just sort of a simplistic way to just sort of show some of the factors.
Sarah, is the green line labeled Arlington County intended to imply that the pricing is the least effective in driving down the demand for parking across those?
How observant. Yes, what that reflects is the number of employees that get subsidized in Arlington County. So in fact, we don't have a lot of people who are paying the full, I mean, that's why it's where, this is was a very subjective, where we drew the lines here, but there are quite a few people who get subsidized for their parking, not the full amount, and then it would be all the way, I mean, there would be further up. But there are some that, it sort of reflects how many people get subsidized for their parking.
Does that also include which parking is free too? So like a lot of people get subsidized and a lot of parking is free?
It's the same thing.
Yeah, it's the same
Well,
thing.
not necessarily, I mean,
What this is meaning really is the employee paying. The developer or the owner might be charging, and then the tenant pays,
Right.
but the employee is not, and that means the commuter. So this is sort of trying to estimate.
this is all still on off-street parking?
Off-street.
Okay, correct.
I think it's worth, I don't mean to interrupt you too much, but I think that there's going to be another slide where this turns out to be built on a little bit, so I want to clarify now, at least a point, that the key to changing the modal split in terms of this particular graph
Right.
is that the actual motorist, or the potential motorist, the user, the commuter,
Right.
that person, the person who makes the decision about how am I going to get to work today, am I going to take the bus, am I going to walk, am I going to ride my bike, or am I going to drive, am I going to drive in a carpool or drive alone, that person, if they are saying, in order to do that today, I will need to pay $10 today to drive my car alone today versus $3 today, or nothing today to take metro or to walk or to bike, that's where it really matters.
Exactly.
So the parking could be free or not free, for example, to their employer. But even if the employer is paying for their parking, if it's not them, the motorist, who's actually receiving the cost, it doesn't make a difference to the mode split.
Thanks.
So there may be the developer separately leases out the parking separately from the office space, right?
And charges $175
Right,
a
and
month.
is receiving
But the
that.
fact that the employee is not paying, and that's what this was just trying to show, is there are a lot of people, in Arlington who have it subsidized, not everybody, but.
So free, in that context, free to the
Yeah.
user
Free
is
to
the
the
same
user,
as subsidized.
Yeah, thanks for clarification. Which is a little bit clarified in the next slide, which in fact we talked, Lori Diggins, who is going to be speaking at our next meeting, who really is the main researcher who has done analysis on mode split for the county. We asked her, so what are the factors that really influence the demand on parking and influence how people make that choice? And she created this slide for me just to sort of summarize, and then she can extrapolate or expand on it the next time at the next meeting. But she said there were three main primary factors that influence how people make that choice, and the existence and the availability of the mode, the travel cost, and the travel time were the three primary factors that influence how people choose to get to work. Secondary, and again this can be highly subjective, safety, convenience, flexibility, reliability, comfort, and familiarity. And we can get into that more detail later.
Is that meant to be, is that a scientifically generated rank ordered list, that secondary one, or is that just the things that have ever been considered to be a factor? Like is comfort definitely much less important than convenience because someone's measured it, or is that just a list of things that we haven't yet quantified, but we know they're factors?
I think you should ask her next, when she's here in 2 weeks. This slide just shows the relationship between parking requirements and mode split. And what it's trying to show is there's a relationship between the mode people use and the size of the garage that's needed. So I use the example of a 300,000 square foot office building with 972 on-site employees. And basically, as we've talked, this isn't true everywhere, but this is using an average of 250 square feet per employee. Okay, so basically what this is showing is that if a developer for a 300,000 square foot office building chooses to build at one space per 250 square feet, he's going to have 1,140 spaces in his garage. If he's only got 972 employees, they could all drive alone to work and we would have no non-SOVs. If he chose or was told to build at his garage at one space per 500 square feet, there would be 500, that would mean there are 570 spaces. With that, 55% of the employees could be SOVs, and 45% would be non-SOVs. You couldn't have any more. That is it. You've got to have that ratio. That's assuming that nobody is parking in another building and nobody is parking on the street. If the developer chooses, or the government tells them to build at 1 space per 750, the garage has got to be, it can only hold 380 spaces. So the SOV rate has to be 34%. 34% of the 972 on-site employees can drive alone to work. 66% have to do something else. The building is built at 1 to 1,000, only 285 spaces, 24% could be SOVs. That's how many can fit in there. 76 have to do some other mode. And then at one space to 1,250, there are only 228 spaces built. So only 17% can drive alone and 83% non-SOV. Does that make sense? So everybody sees the implications of if you've got a small garage, you've got to have a mode split that looks like that.
So, just a quick note, GSA, for example, in terms of space usage per employee, uses about 200 usable square foot to every employee. So, you know, if you have one space for every 250 square feet, then, you know, you have a little over a space per employee.
Well, the 200 that's
Yeah.
usable.
Yeah,
That's
that-
probably like 300 or so. But
So-
There are different measurements of square footage, but that's roughly the number.
Wanted to just share with the group a little bit what the county has been, what the methodology or what the approach is that we have been using for what happens when a developer wants less parking. And I took the example, they were both done at the same time in January of last year, both approved at the same time. The example of 3001, the Penzance building and the funeral home site. This is generally how the county approached looking at the request from the developers when they asked for less parking. Basically, what staff did is looked at the neighborhood characteristics, they looked at the density. One project is in Clarendon, the other is Virginia Square. Looked at the density and the land use, looked at the access to transit and bike infrastructure, then determined the parking demand, looked at estimated the mode split of the employees based on mode split numbers that we had, determined the actual parking ratio of nearby garages based on occupancy survey. The county went in and measured, saw how full neighboring garages were and said, oh, okay, they're at this kind of ratio in reality. And so that helped staff figure out what the parking demand was. And then looked at how the buildings were going to be managed, how were the parking garages going to be managed.
Sarah, with the estimate for the mode split, was it different for each of the buildings? Based on neighborhood characteristics or
No, in fact,
tenant or?
basically it was looking at, for the whole neighborhood. We used the same mode split for both projects. It was based on the commercial building survey.
But those are different neighborhoods, that's what she was asking.
Yeah, one's in Clarendon, one's
We, in
Clarendon.
fact, the only data we have on mode split combines Clarendon and Virginia Square. The data wasn't, we didn't have enough data to, it wasn't granular enough.
Sarah, one of the other things too is the Virginia Square project includes a black box theater,
Yeah, right.
which has different parking demand with shared office. And the Penzance project has quite a large retail component.
Yeah, I'm sort of simplifying it all. There are other complicating factors with both of them, but this is sort of the general approach of how we look at things like this.
Well, I think it also bears mentioning the difficulty the county had with determining the appropriate parking ratio on the Penzance project
Right.
is what led directly to the county board
Starting
charging this group, right?
That is exactly right.
So
That is
it's
exactly-
not necessarily an example of how we did it perfectly, it's an example of how we struggled to do it right.
I would totally agree with that. Yes, thank you.
Sarah,
Yes.
you may talk about this, but I probably not easy to answer. How much time does this take county staff to figure out? So I would suggest that should go into this too a little bit, because some of these are very specific things where you could be like, yeah, if you are to study that tells you the mode split of the neighborhood, it's theoretically fairly easy to be like, okay, this is generally the mode split, we'll make that assumption. But like, looking at density and land use mix, I mean, that is so specific, block to block. I mean, the amount of time it takes to do that, and I guess the low count, we don't have a lot of staff to do all the things we wanna do. I mean, how long, are we talking 15 hours? Are we talking 40 hours? Are we talking 600 hours? I mean.
There's a trick to some of that, which is to
Right.
require the developer to put the information in the application.
Right, okay.
But it requires the staff to analyze that information.
Right, and then, I mean, like, if we're including like site plan meetings, I mean, I'm just trying, I mean, I don't know that you ever
And you're
have a
totally
guess,
right, and
but
the 4 departments that are involved in this too.
Damn.
So you've got staff,
A lot.
it's tax dollars, man, that's
Well,
like
and part
going
of our
to
charge, right, is to come up with something that's more efficient and more transparent.
I'm sure Marty Wells would be happy to be paid to do all this.
right.
Is that okay?
Can I point out that in the things you listed as factors, though, again, price is not there.
Correct. Price of the construction
We've
or
talked-
price
no, not the
of
cost
the
of
charging?
construction, price and its influence on demand, right? We've talked
Okay.
about how critical that is as a tool to, depending on your point of view, influence behavior or get the market to work efficiently.
In part because we don't know at this stage what the price will be with our current policy tools.
But it also, if you're talking about the price, again, that the user, that the motorist is paying, we have no way of knowing how many, well, we are getting, and this is one thing we could ask Lori Diggins next week, what percentage of the businesses are subsidizing, what kind of a subsidy they're getting, but we have no control. Is this group going to propose that we're going to regulate what kind of subsidies an employer can
Well,
give to his?
we've taken other steps through site plan conditions to make price more transparent, like unbundling it on the residential side from the rent.
And in fact, policy 10 of the parking and curb space management policy is to do exactly that, to the extent that we can do it. And I'm not sure we've done all we can do.
Right.
Yeah.
Point well taken. So the next slide is about, okay, once we look at supply and demand, okay, now we have to decide what are the mitigating measures. So if they do reduce parking, what are we going to do to make sure that we get the incentives, we get people to get the infrastructure? So we start with the base TDM. So there is a base TDM that the county has that they require of everybody. And what is the usual infrastructure improvements that are done? Usually with any project, you will always do a transportation impact analysis, and you will say, oh, generally they'll need to improve the sidewalks or something like that. So you start with the base. Then internal staff discussion, these 4 departments getting together regarding proposal and the mitigating measures, and you assess what additional infrastructure is needed to handle the shift in demand. If all of a sudden they're asking for a lot less parking, we're going to have a lot more people walking and biking, you might need some more curb cuts, you might need whatever. Transit as well, and assessment of needed incentives to encourage this modal shift to the non-SOVs. And also recognizing that more incentives are needed for buildings in areas with low parking ratios. If you're already in Roslyn at 1 to 1,000, 1 to 1,200, whatever, or let's say 1 to 1,000, and the developer wants to build less than 1 to 1,000, 1 to 1,000 is already, as you saw on that other slide, not very much parking. So you might need a lot more incentives in a place that already has low parking, So, anyway. Some points.
There's a menu, right, that you choose, you have the base TDM, and then there's like lots of other stuff, or are there stuff they can choose from off the menu, developers, or can they bring like creative solutions?
There's definitely a lot of negotiation. And the staff will bring, here's a laundry list, and the developers will bring the laundry list, and yeah.
But that's not necessarily a good thing, because the ambiguity about how that negotiation is going. One thing we hear from developers is, well, the guy 3 years ago had to do A, B, and C. So I came in ready to do A, B, and C. Actually, they came in ready to do A and B, and we're hoping to negotiate over C.
Right.
And then they said, well, you're saying that now A, B, C, and D is the minimum, which I didn't even hear about, because you just decided 2 months ago. And then you're also asking me to do E, F, and G. And so now my whole, 2 whatever
Performance.
the document we have that decides whether or not it's gonna go forward, but the numbers won't work anymore, right? And so having ambiguity about what's on the menu, there aren't necessarily, I think this is what you were getting at, there aren't right now formulas for a lot of this stuff. It's just staff sort of stick their finger in the air and say, our best guess is that you could probably do this, and why don't you do that? And
We hope
It's
it's
free form.
It's not
But that's
predictable.
I might not go quite as, I mean, we'll definitely look at what other cities
You're
have
not gonna
done.
be
We've
invited
got some,
at least you don't ask the bankers, right?
no,
That's right.
They have final say.
That's
They
where
just kind of,
the
yeah.
predictable and fair
Okay.
comes in.
Well, that's right.
And you also get some staff time back.
Right, I just want to imply that that's what's happening.
So,
Yeah.
so let's keep going, but I mean, this does start to get us into all the milieu of what we're dealing with here, and it's a lot of complex stuff.
okay, so, I guess we can say back in 2007, which was now 6 years ago, the Master Transportation Plan was started, and the first document that was created, and Peter was very involved in it, and Chris, you were involved
Yeah,
too.
it started in 2004 or 5.
Yeah, I guess it was. So for instance, this document is the goals and policies document, which was the first one done, and this has the overall goals and policies. And then what happened afterwards were 6 elements that were much more specific, were done afterwards. So there's 6 goals that are up on the screen that are in this document. They're overriding goals: provide high-quality transportation services, move more people without more traffic, promote safety, establish equity, and manage effectively and efficiently, advance environmental sustainability. So that was adopted in 2007. And then the parking and curb space management element was adopted in 2009, which Peter and I did work on it. And I do have, if anybody, I've got about 6 copies if people want their own printed copy of it. I've got copies here that people can have, and it's also online. So in that document, there were 13 policies, parking and curb space management policies. 5 of them had to do with on-street, 7 had to do with off-street, and 1 policy had to do with disabilities, persons with disabilities. So of the 7 off-street parking policies, so this is a summary of what they are. I guess I'll read through them very quickly. You can all read through it. Number 6, ensure that minimum parking needs are met and excessive parking is not built. Divert resources saved by reducing excess off-street parking to other community benefits. 7, discourage off-street surface parking. 8, and I did summarize some of the words on here. 8, allow reduced parking space requirements in close proximity to frequent transit, require enhanced TDM measures for developments with reduced quantities of parking, allow site plan and use permit developments to meet off-street parking requirements. 9, maximize sharing of parking spaces. 9, discourage assigned parking. 10, encourage unbundling of the price of parking from the price of owning, renting, or leasing a housing or office unit. Discourage subsidized parking. 11, reduce or eliminate parking requirements for specialized projects near transit nodes when they advance related transportation goals. Tailor TDM measures appropriately. 12, establish programs in which a property owner pays a fee to the county or another parking provider in lieu of providing all required spaces on site. So what I chose, and Peter has mentioned policy 10, and that wasn't one of the ones I chose, but the 4 that I chose were 6, 8, 11, and 12 to spend some time on. 6, which I read before, basically, and I highlighted some of what I thought were the main important points. What 6 talks about is the importance of getting the parking right. I mean, this is for the motorists, the building businesses, the development community, and the neighboring community. And diverting resources saved by reducing excess off-street parking to other community benefits. So what that's going to mean that we have to do is define what does excess off-street parking mean, and we have to decide what is appropriate benefits to support. Later on, you'll see that each one of these policies has implementation measures. Some of them have 2, some of them have 15. There are 4 here that I wanted to point out related to policy 6, that it said perform site-specific analysis of building parking demand, supply in the immediate area, which was defined as less than 1/8 of a mile, and the constraints and efficiencies of parking construction. define parking demand for each site using these factors: TDM measures, local market pricing, management of facility, access to infrastructure and services for public transit and alternative modes, density and land mix. Parking built in excess of minimum site needs should be shared and potentially allow reduction in parking requirements for nearby parcels. This was what we were talking a little bit before with Gary. Parking levels approved below the amounts set forth in the zoning ordinance should be ameliorated by shared parking agreements, increased TDM contributions, alternative mitigations, and community benefits. Then policy 8, the extra points I just wanted to make about that was there's additional emphasis on developments in close proximity to transit, enhanced TDM measures, and talks again about shared parking. In the implementation measures, it refers to county board approved guidelines should be created, which we don't have right now, which this group is doing. And it requires specific circumstances which make reduced parking appropriate. And it says that the TDM strategies should be consistent with the magnitude of the reduction from the by right parking requirement. Policy 11.
Sarah, what's the by right parking requirement?
Okay. The by right parking requirement in the case of office is 1 space per 250 square feet.
See, that's the benchmark for measuring TDM compensation.
Now, so what we have, as I mentioned before, we have a base TDM for a standard site plan, like that we have. It's 6 cents per square foot, goes to incentives, and then there's some other things. That is the base TDM that gets you from the by right to being a site plan. Now this is saying TDM standard can be consistent with the magnitude of reduction from the by right. So we've already got a standard that gets us to a regular site plan has a base TDM. Now this group is up for discussion. Do we want to go further? Is that base TDM appropriate for situations where we have less parking? But the by right now is 1 to 250.
Doesn't it depend on the use of the building, retail, and then versus medical versus first or second floor versus above?
Yeah. I was simplifying. Well, in by right, it's 1 to 250. In site plan, I think maybe we could wait. It's more complicated. In the next meeting, Bob Duffy is going to talk about the whole site plan process and all the different site plan requirements. But yes, you're right, with site plan there are exemptions for restaurants close to metro. There are some different ones in site plan.
And we'll get more into it next time.
And we'll get more into it in the next meeting.
We had to figure out some way to pace this stuff out, and it's just a lot of stuff.
Yeah, it's too bad. So Tom, tell Bob I'm covering this stuff here, but I thought some of it would be helpful to explain the context. Policy 8 talks about additional emphasis. Oh wait, I did that.
Yeah, here. Yeah.
Thank you. Policy 11. This was the one that talks about emphasis on developments that advance county goals, such as affordable housing, the construction of new transit facilities, or retail. It says you can reduce parking if you advance these other goals. And some of the implementation actions, again, it says develop guidelines for adjusting the parking requirements. And it also says to use the comprehensive planning processes, such as sector planning efforts, to identify special opportunities for development with reduced or eliminated parking requirements. So getting to when the Planning Commission gets into these sector plans, like right now, I think while we're down here, they're talking about the Roslyn sector plan. Is there an opportunity for them to right now be talking about an opportunity for reduced parking, and should it be looked at in that process?
Sarah, I'm sorry to keep interrupting, but on that policy, I would say at the time that policy was developed,
Yep.
the conversation about that policy, which goes back to 2006 when it was first written and put in the goals and policies as a document, that was, most of the discussion about that was for extraordinary, very highly unique situations. Commonly, places where someone's building literally directly over a metro stop, and where they might not physically be able to build the parking. And so we were saying, well, in such a case, we might want to, first of all, identify it in the sector plan and say, all right, well, this one parcel, it's not going to be able to build its parking. And so we're gonna ask for different stuff. Maybe they'll build the new metro elevator at that site, right? And that'll be a gigantic cost, and they won't build a parking garage, but then we'll have to plan in the sector for where the 30% or the 50% of the SOV trips are gonna go to that building.
He's got to modify your numbers to make them realistic, because
Yeah,
truly,
it does depend on the numbers then.
Well, no, it does depend on the numbers, but, let's put it in another scenario. Would you rather put your $50,000 into a low-yielding stock, go on the stock exchange, buy a low-yielding bond, stock, whatever you want to call it, or would you rather just take that $500 and, leave it on a table somewhere and
But
see,
doesn't
the
it,
other thing is
doesn't it
parking.
depend on a variety of things, including whether that means you're building another level versus finishing
Yeah,
at
there's
level
so many
you
different
already-
factors,
I mean,
but just.
I'm not sure
high
that
level.
it's as absolute as your statement
Mhm.
makes it sound.
Yeah, that's pretty damn absolute, and
You
that's
know,
why
yeah.
I'm struggling with the same thing
I mean,
Peter's struggling with. I don't really
If the
understand
in lieu
the sense.
fee is a known number for X number of years that you can plug into a pro forma versus $50,000 a space, that's a sunk cost that you've still gotta pay debt on.
And no
that
guaranteed
entire
revenue.
See, but then that's the
But that's
difference.
all built
Are they
into it.
paying 3% on their
Well,
mortgage money or 12%?
Right, and is it your
Yeah.
money or somebody else's? I mean, there's a whole lot of factors.
There's a
in
number of
it.
different yield factors. I mean, I can tell you the specifics. Specifically, we get between a 7 and a 9, off target between a 7 and a 9 yield on our commercial and residential buildings. Typically on parking, we get between a 2 and a 5.5% yield. So although it dilutes our yield, it's still a good bond. It's in fact, 2.5% above the U.S. Treasury rate right now.
In today's environment, it's still a good deal.
Right, so it's a great deal.
Today.
Today.
Yeah, I
Now,
was gonna say, yeah.
Today for a space that you expect to be able to actually rent out because it's not vacant.
we look at it on a blended basis, if that makes sense. So, yeah, we're making a 5 yield on one space and a 0 yield on another space. It's still a 2.5
All
blended.
right, let's
Yeah,
get
I'm
back to
almost
Sarah
done.
and
Sorry.
let her finish.
So just a little bit about demographic trends and pressures. Basically, the next two slides show the growth over the next 30 years of what's expected for the county. As you can see in the RB corridor, there's expected population growth of 36, almost 37%. In the JD corridor, 19%. Columbia Pike, 27% increased population over the next 30 years. Employment, RB corridor expected growth of 52%, JD corridor 41%, Columbia Pike 1%. So just some interesting numbers as we talk about planning for
And this whole streetcar, and I'm not being obnoxious, this whole streetcar conversation, if the main proponents are right, makes your projections in Columbia Pike very wrong. I mean, they would argue vehemently with you that there's going to be an enormous amount of employment.
That I don't know. I don't think we're going to that conversation.
Yeah, and that's not a factor in the way they build these numbers.
No. The only other thing I just also wanted to point out, and Dennis mentioned this last time, is the number of employees who come into Arlington to work here. It's about 80% of the employees come from outside the county. Only 20% of the employees who work here live here. So that's just something to think about when we're looking at all these mode splits, when we're looking at incentives, how are we going to get people to use these different modes? We can't convince our own residents, we have to convince people from outside, and we have to have infrastructure also that can help the region. I think Dennis mentioned about carpool and vanpool, because the Orange Line is so full and things like that. So is there something we can do to help that?
And Sarah, on that point, there is actually an equity issue that was identified during the Master Transportation Plan study, even within Arlington, that we established early on in the plenary group that Chris served on, that we were never going to be able to provide adequate transit service to every resident. There are some places in Arlington where we can see that there isn't adequate transit, and there never will be, because they're not dense enough or they're in a pocket where we can't do it. And so in order to provide equitable transportation choices, there's a certain minimum number of people in Arlington who or for reasons of disability, where we say there's some, we're never going to get to 0 drive-alone trips. That's not our goal, that's not our expectation, and it wouldn't be equitable to plan for actually having 0 SMB
Without a
trips.
doubt.
Maybe it would be 5%, you know, it's not necessarily a huge number, but even within Arlington, it's not 0.
Great. Okay, and that's it.
Thanks.
Well done.